On a sweltering August night in 1969, the Hollywood Hills held their breath, unaware that an entire generation's dream was about to be brutally murdered. Up on Cielo Drive, nestled in the winding canyons that separated the stars from the city below, a secluded home glowed like a lantern in the dark. It was a fortress of success, a symbol of a life beautifully lived. Inside, actress Sharon Tate, 8.5 months pregnant, was the very picture of golden age innocence, her future as bright as the California sun. She was surrounded by friends, a celebrated hairstylist, an heiress, a writer, their laughter echoing softly in the warm, still air. The atmosphere was one of quiet celebration, of life on the cusp of blossoming. This was the pinnacle of the American dream, a world insulated by fame and fortune, seemingly untouchable, a perfect scene from a movie that was about to take a horrific turn. But outside this bubble of light, a different reality was creeping up the hill. It arrived not in a limousine, but in a rusted, sputtering car, a ghost from the desert crawling towards the heart of the city. From it emerged shadows, figures so young they could have been anyone's children, their faces blank, their movements unnervingly calm. They were not driven by greed or the familiar motives of common criminals. Their pockets were empty, but their minds were full of a dark gospel, a twisted prophecy whispered to them under the vast, indifferent desert sky by a man who promised them everything by demanding they become nothing. Their leader was not with them, yet his presence was in every step they took, his voice a permanent echo in their heads. He was a failed musician, a charismatic drifter with eyes that had seen the inside of a prison cell far more than a recording studio. He had promised them a revolution, a chaotic race war he called helter-skelter. He had taken their search for love and belonging, the very essence of their generation, and forged it into a weapon. They were his family, his instruments, their wills entirely surrendered to his. That night, the illusion of safety that money and fame could buy would be torn apart with savage finality. The screams would be swallowed by the canyon, and a single word, scrawled in a victim's blood, would announce the violent, incomprehensible end of an era. The question that still haunts us, that echoes from that dark hill, is not just what happened on Cielo Drive. It is how it was allowed to happen. How did a man with nothing become a god to the lost? And how did he turn the children of the summer of love into the cold-blooded architects of a nightmare? To understand the blood spilled on Cielo Drive, one must first understand the ground from which this darkness grew. The soil of 1969 America was fertile for nightmares. The year was not an island in time. It was the violent, frothing crest of a wave that had been building for a turbulent decade. The nation was a house divided, holding a mirror to its own fractured face. The chasm wasn't just political, it was generational. A silent war fought across dinner tables, where fathers in suits stared at sons with hair past their shoulders, each seeing a stranger, a betrayal of their world. This Cold War at home was fueled by a hot war abroad. Vietnam was the first television war, a nightly ritual of grainy, monochrome horror bleeding into the nation's living rooms. The distant rattle of machine gun fire became the soundtrack to suburban life, and the jungle mud seemed to stain the carpets. The names of fallen soldiers, young men from towns everyone knew, became a daily litany of loss, while on college campuses their peers burned draft cards in public acts of defiance, their faces a mixture of fear and righteous fury against the conflict they refused to inherit. The dream of a unified, Camelot-era America had been assassinated along with its champions. The gunshots that failed John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., and Robert Kennedy had left behind more than just bodies. They had created a void, a deep, cynical wound in the collective psyche. Hope itself seemed to be in a coffin. Trust in the institutions that were meant to be pillars of society, the government, the police, the presidency, was eroding like sandstone in a storm, leaving a foundation of paranoia and suspicion. Cities burned with the heat of racial tension. The beautiful promise of civil rights met with the brutal reality of fire hoses, police batons, and snarling dogs. Hope itself seemed to be in a coffin. Trust in the institutions that were meant to be pillars of society, the government, the police, the presidency, was eroding like sandstone in a storm, leaving a foundation of paranoia and suspicion. Cities burned with the heat of racial tension. The beautiful promise of civil rights met with the brutal reality of fire hoses, police batons, and snarling dogs. Into this whirlwind of disillusionment stepped the counterculture. It had begun as a gentle rebellion, a summer of love painted in psychedelic colors, promising peace, universal love, and a new, enlightened way of being. But by 1969, the flowers in their hair were wilting. The idealism had curdled into something desperate and dark. The Haight-Ashbury district, once a beacon for dreamers, was now a haven for predators and addicts. For every commune built on shared hope, another was descending into a paranoid fortress fueled by bad acid and charismatic leaders with hollow eyes. Young people, thousands of them, were runaways, not just from their homes, but from an entire value system they saw as a hypocritical, materialistic lie. They were spiritual refugees, orphans of a broken promise, searching for a new truth, a new family, a new father. Adrift in a sea of uncertainty, they were desperate for an anchor, for any voice that could make sense of the chaos. And in the shadows of this national crisis, a marketplace for souls had opened. Gurus, prophets, and manipulators emerged, recognizing the profound hunger in the eyes of the lost. They offered answers, belonging, and purpose to those who had none. But what happened after this societal breakdown is even more surprising. Because the most dangerous of these new prophets didn't come from a peaceful ashram in India or a political podium. His gospel wasn't one of peace. It came from the cold, concrete echo of a federal prison, a philosophy honed by a lifetime of rejection and rage. It belonged to a man who looked upon the coming chaos not as a tragedy, but as a glorious, divine opportunity. His name was Charles Manson. But at birth, he had no name at all, listed on his birth certificate as No Name Maddox. He was a ghost from the very beginning, born into the world as a void, an unwritten page in a story no one wanted to claim. His childhood was not a series of memories, but a collection of abandonments, a blur of transient homes and the cold, sterile arms of the state. He was a boy passed between indifferent relatives and institutions, each with its own set of walls, its own brutal code. While other children learned multiplication tables, Manson was learning the dark calculus of survival. He became a connoisseur of human weakness, an expert in the subtle fractures that run through a personality. Reform schools and prisons became his classrooms and his crucible. In the echoing silence of solitary confinement, he didn't find penitence, he found his university. He devoured books on influencing people, twisting the lessons of Dale Carnegie into a predator's handbook. He studied Scientology not for salvation, but to dissect its methods of control. He watched pimps and con artists, absorbing their grammar of power, their ability to turn affection into a currency and loyalty into a cage. He learned to read the hollow spaces in a person's soul, the voids left by absent fathers and broken homes, and to fill those spaces with himself. He was a creature of concrete and steel, molded by a system that sought to contain him, but instead perfected his predatory instincts. He emerged from prison in 1967, blinking in the psychedelic sunlight of a world he didn't recognize. He was 32 years old, having spent more than half his life behind bars. He stepped out into the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco, the very epicenter of the summer of love, an analog monster in a digital age of peace. But he didn't see flowers and love. He saw a field ripe for harvest, a flock of lambs wandering without a shepherd. These were the children of privilege and neglect, the runaways and the dreamers, their eyes wide with chemical wonder and spiritual hunger. They were all searching for an answer, a truth, a father. And Manson, with his intense, unblinking stare and a guitar full of borrowed songs, offered them one. He didn't begin with prophecies of war. He began with a counterfeit love, a carefully constructed illusion of acceptance. He offered them a community, a family, a word he wielded with surgical precision. He spoke their language of freedom, but his definition was a sinister inversion. To him, freedom was the shedding of all morality, all rules, all identity, except for the one he gave them. He collected the broken pieces of other people's families and glued them together with a powerful toxic adhesive. Absolute validation followed by absolute control. He used LSD not as a key to unlock consciousness, but as a crowbar to pry open their minds, leaving them vulnerable to his programming. He was the father they never had, the guru who saw their specialness, the one person who promised he would never, ever leave them. Only this is just the first layer of this story. Because to forge a true family of followers, to complete their transformation from lost children into instruments of his will, he needed to sever their last ties to the outside world. He needed to isolate them entirely in a place where his voice would be the only one they heard, a desolate stage for the final act of their indoctrination. That place was Spawn Ranch, a dusty, dilapidated movie set on the outskirts of Los Angeles, where the ghosts of old westerns still clung to the rotting facades of a forgotten American dream. It was a world of illusion, a fitting backdrop for the false reality Manson was constructing. Here, surrounded by the harsh, indifferent beauty of the California desert, the family was truly cut off. The sun beat down with a relentless, punishing glare, baking the earth and blurring the line between day and night, between sanity and delusion. The air was thick with the smell of dry sagebrush and decay, a constant reminder of their isolation. They were living in a purgatory of Manson's design, a place where the rules of the outside world no longer applied, and time itself seemed to warp around his will. Life at the ranch was a strange cocktail of communal drudgery and psychological theater. Days were spent on the raw mechanics of survival, scavenging for food in supermarket dumpsters, maintaining the crumbling property for its nearly blind and aging owner, George Spahn, who allowed them to stay in exchange for labor and the company of Manson's female followers. But the nights belonged to Charlie. Around the crackling campfire, under a blanket of stars that seemed both infinite and suffocating, he held court. He was no longer just a musician or a charismatic ex-con. He was their teacher, their father, their prophet. His voice, a hypnotic rasp, filled the darkness, weaving tales that became their new scripture. And his lessons were becoming darker, more invasive. He began orchestrating marathon LSD sessions, not as journeys of self-discovery, but as brutal exercises in ego demolition. While his followers were lost in psychedelic confusion, their defenses shattered and their perceptions unmoored, Manson would whisper his doctrines directly into their minds. He was the sole anchor in a sea of chaos he himself had created. He staged bizarre, cruel psychodramas, forcing them to confront their deepest fears, reenact their childhood traumas, and ultimately to ritually surrender their individual identities to him. He was breaking them down, piece by piece, atom by atom, only to rebuild them in his own twisted image. They were becoming extensions of his consciousness, limbs of a single malevolent organism. It was in this crucible of isolation and mental attrition that the breaking point was finally reached. Manson unveiled his grand prophecy, a paranoid and violent vision he had supposedly decoded from the Beatles' White Album.
He called it Helter Skelter. It was a terrifyingly vivid story of an impending, apocalyptic race war that would tear society apart. He preached that Black America would rise up in a frenzy of violence and slaughter the white establishment, but in their supposed inferiority, would be unable to govern in the aftermath. And who would emerge from their hiding place in the desert to take control? The family. They were the chosen ones, the true masters, destined to inherit the earth. The prophecy gave their squalor a purpose, their obedience a divine mission. They were no longer just runaways and outcasts. They were soldiers in a holy war, the architects of a new world order. Here begins the darkest part of the story. Because a prophecy needs a catalyst, an apocalypse needs a trigger. Manson's vision required a spark, a series of acts so brutal, so theatrical, and so senseless that they would shock the world and, in his deranged logic, show the black man how to begin the slaughter.
The family would have to become the bloody hand that set the world on fire. They had been broken, they had been remade, and now they were being armed. The time for listening was over. The time for action, for murder, was about to begin. The first target was a music teacher, Gary Hinman. The motive was mundane, almost pathetic: money. Manson sent 3 followers to get an inheritance Hinman didn't have. For 2 days they held him captive in his own home, a quiet space now filled with dread. When he refused, Manson himself arrived. With a sword, he sliced Hinman's ear, a brutal act of escalation meant to bind his followers to him through shared violence. After Manson left, the order was clear. Hinman was stabbed to death. On the wall, using his blood, they scrawled "Political Piggy," the first clumsy attempt to frame the Black Panthers and ignite Helter Skelter. But this desperate act was only a dress rehearsal. Manson was furious.
The murder was messy, inefficient, and hadn't caused the panic he envisioned. He gathered his followers under the cold desert stars and told them they had to commit a crime so gruesome, so devoid of conventional motive, that it would leave the establishment paralyzed with fear. He chose his instruments with chilling precision. Tex Watson, his lieutenant, and 3 girls, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian. Their destination was 10050 Cielo Drive, a secluded home in the Benedict Canyon Hills. It was a place Manson knew, once home to a record producer who had rejected him. The house was a symbol of the world that shut him out, and now he would burn that world down. On the night of August 8th, 1969, the air in Los Angeles was thick with summer heat. Inside the house, a pregnant Sharon Tate was entertaining 4 friends. It was a scene of quiet domesticity, a snapshot of the Hollywood dream, utterly oblivious to the nightmare approaching. Outside, 4 figures dressed in black, armed with knives and a gun, moved toward the house. They were not driven by rage or greed. They were pilgrims on a holy mission, their minds scrubbed clean of empathy, their actions dictated by the will of one man, miles away. Their instructions were simple and monstrous: destroy everyone inside, as brutally as possible. Tex Watson climbed a pole and cut the phone lines, severing the house from the world. As they moved onto the property, 18-year-old Stephen Parent was leaving in his car. He was the first to die, shot 4 times before he could scream. The killers then slipped into the house like ghosts. What followed into a descent into a kind of hell that defies rational explanation. It was not a robbery. It was a ritual. Wojciech Frykowski, asleep on a couch, was awoken by Watson's boot and a single chilling phrase: "I'm the devil, and I'm here to do the devil's business." The next minutes were a whirlwind of terror and unimaginable violence. The victims were hunted through the house and onto the lawn, their pleas for mercy met with a terrifying vacant obedience. The killers stabbed and stabbed long after life had fled, driven by an ecstatic fervor. In the end, 5 people lay dead. On the front door, in Sharon Tate's blood, Susan Atkins wrote a single word: pig. The message was delivered. The apocalypse in Manson's mind had officially begun. But one night of carnage was not enough. Back at Spawn Ranch, Manson was not celebratory. He was furious. The Tate murders, in his eyes, had been a sloppy, panicked affair. His followers had been clumsy, their frenzy lacking the cold, ritualistic precision he had envisioned. The message he believed had been garbled by their incompetence. The apocalypse he was trying to ignite required a more deliberate hand. So, on the following night, August 10th, he decided to join the hunt himself. Not to kill, but to demonstrate, to show his family how it was truly done. He drove with 6 of his most devoted followers, cruising through the sleeping neighborhoods of Los Angeles like a predator stalking its territory. The choice of victims was chillingly arbitrary. After considering and discarding several other locations, Manson settled on the home of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca, a supermarket executive and his wife. He had no connection to them. Their home was simply the one he chose. This randomness was a key part of the terror. It meant no one was safe. Manson entered the house alone first, a phantom in the quiet suburban dark. He woke Leno LaBianca from his couch at gunpoint, and with a terrifying, almost gentle authority, he and Tex Watson bound the couple. He reassured them they would not be harmed, a final, cruel act of psychological manipulation before he stepped back outside, leaving his disciples to complete the ritual. What followed was a reenactment of the previous night's horror, but colder, more methodical. The violence was just as extreme, but it lacked the chaotic frenzy of the Tate house. It was a performance of obedience. Afterward, the killers scrawled messages in their victims' blood across the walls and refrigerator. Death to pigs, and the now infamous phrase, "Helter Skelter," misspelled in their haste. When the sun rose, it was on a city gripped by a fear it had never known. Los Angeles, the city of dreams, awoke to a nightmare. The news spread like a virus, transforming the sun-drenched Hollywood Hills into a landscape of paranoia. The illusion of safety, particularly for the wealthy and famous who lived behind their unlocked doors, was irrevocably shattered. Gun stores sold out in hours. Private security firms were inundated with calls. Guard dogs became the new status symbol. The idyllic promise of California living, the open doors, the easy trust, evaporated overnight. The free-loving, psychedelic dream of the 1960s had not just ended, it had been murdered. This was the true birth of Manson's modern consequence. He hadn't just orchestrated a series of brutal killings. He had weaponized the counterculture against itself, twisting its symbols of peace and rebellion into instruments of pure terror. The police were utterly baffled, unable to connect the two grisly crime scenes. The violence was so extreme, so devoid of any traditional motive like robbery or revenge, that it seemed to be the work of something beyond rational comprehension. Rumors of satanic cults and drug deals gone wrong filled the void of information. The fear was that anyone, anywhere, could be next. The monster was no longer an outsider at the gates. It was an invisible force that could be living right next door. The Manson family had become a dark mirror held up to America, and the terrifying reflection of its own fractured soul would haunt its consciousness for decades to come. But behind the screaming headlines and the chilling cultural analyses, individual worlds had ended. For every wave of public terror, there was a private, silent ocean of grief, bottomless and cold. Nowhere was this more palpable than in the story of Doris Tate, Sharon Tate's mother. She was not a public figure, not an activist, not a voice in the cultural debate. She was a mother who whose world and whose future had been stolen in a single blood-soaked night. While the world debated the meaning of Manson, she lived with its consequence. The nursery prepared for her unborn grandson remained a silent, hollow monument to a life that would never be. The media circus churned outside her door, turning her daughter into a symbol, a tragic headline. But for Doris, the loss was tactile and absolute. The absence of a voice on the phone, the empty chair at the dinner table, the crushing weight of a future erased. For years, this grief was a private burden. The world moved on. The 1970s unfolded with new anxieties, and the Manson family killers settled into a strange, dark celebrity behind bars. Their faces, unaged by remorse, would occasionally surface in news reports, a grotesque reminder of the unhealed wound. For Doris, and for the families of the other victims, there was no moving on. There was only the slow, grinding passage of time, measured not in years, but in the anniversaries of loss. The public's memory began to fade, the sharp edges of the horror softening into a kind of morbid folklore. But the justice system has a memory of its own, and it is governed by calendars and laws, not by pain. The day inevitably came when the first of her daughter's murderers became eligible for parole. That news was a second shockwave, a desecration of memory. The idea that these individuals, who had shown no remorse and had destroyed so many lives with such casual brutality, could one day walk free was an unbearable injustice. It was in that moment that something inside Doris Tate shifted. The quiet, enduring grief was forged into a voice of fire. The private agony was about to become a very public crusade. She knew she could not remain silent. To do so would be to let her daughter be murdered all over again, this time by apathy and the passage of time. She gathered her strength, not from a place of vengeance, but from a deep, primal well of maternal love. Doris Tate walked into those cold, sterile parole hearings, not as a broken woman, but as a warrior armed with the memory of what was taken from her. She stood before the unrepentant faces of Manson's followers, Tex Watson, Patricia Krenwinkel, Susan Atkins, and she spoke. Her voice, steady and clear, cut through the legal jargon and psychological assessments. She did not speak of statistics or statutes. She spoke of the life sentence of pain they had imposed on her family. She described the finality of her daughter's death, the silence of her grandson who never drew a breath, and contrasted it with the killer's privilege of breathing, of hoping, of one day seeing the son as a free person. Her words were not just for the parole board. They were for a society that was beginning to forget the human cost. She carried petitions with thousands of signatures, a physical manifestation of a collective refusal to forget. She became the face of a new movement, fighting for victims' rights, ensuring that the voices of the silenced would echo in the halls of justice, louder than the pleas of their killers. Her struggle was a testament to the fact that the true battle against evil is not fought with weapons, but with memory, and with the relentless, unbreakable love for those who are gone. And in this, we find the final, chilling lesson of the Manson family. The story is not truly about Charles Manson himself. He was merely a symptom of a deeper societal illness, a vacuum of meaning that he so expertly filled in the fractured landscape of the late 1960s. He was a dark mirror, held up to a generation disillusioned by war, alienated by consumerism, and desperately searching for an authentic truth in a world that felt increasingly artificial. He saw the cracks in the foundation of society and understood with predatory clarity that within those cracks grew a profound human yearning, the need to belong, to believe in something larger than oneself, to have a purpose whispered into an empty soul. His power was not supernatural. It was terrifyingly human, born from the mechanics of psychological manipulation. He offered a broken family to those who had none, a twisted utopia to those who saw only dystopia around them. He isolated them, physically and mentally, severing their ties to the outside world, until his voice was the only one they could hear. He became their sun, and they, his devoted planets, their orbits fixed by his gravitational pull of charisma and fear. The horror that unfolded on Cielo Drive and Waverly Drive was not a spontaneous eruption of madness. It was the calculated, inevitable result of a process, a methodical dismantling of individual identity, a systematic erosion of empathy, and the complete annihilation of a moral compass. It teaches us that the most dangerous monsters are not those who are born, but those who are made. They are forged in the quiet heat of isolation, in echo chambers of paranoia, and under the spell of a voice that promises salvation while demanding the ultimate sacrifice, the self. The young men and women who carried out his orders were not inherently evil. They were empty vessels, and Manson filled that emptiness with his own unique brand of poison. A cocktail of messianic delusion, racial animus, and apocalyptic prophecy. He did not create their vulnerability. He simply found it and exploited it with the skill of a master puppeteer. Today, the Spawn Ranch is a ruin, a ghost on the California landscape. But the deserts of alienation are vaster than ever. The methods of manipulation have evolved, finding new, more insidious homes in the digital ether. In the silent glow of screens, charismatic figures still prey on the lost and the lonely, building virtual families on foundations of shared grievances and curated realities. Algorithmic echo chambers now do the work of isolating followers, reinforcing paranoia and shielding them from dissenting views with terrifying efficiency. The Manson family, therefore, is not a closed chapter of history. It is a permanent, haunting warning. It reminds us that the line between a community and a cult, between a follower and a fanatic, is perilously thin and easily crossed when critical thought is abandoned. The ultimate defense against this darkness is not to simply condemn it or lock it away. It is to understand the voids that allow it to grow in the first place. It is a call for empathy, for connection, and for the courage to confront the uncomfortable truth that the capacity for such horror lies not in some distant, monstrous other, but within the fragile architecture of the human soul itself, in its deep-seated fear of being alone. The story of the Manson family is a timeless reminder that the most important battles are fought within, against the siren call of simple answers to complex questions, and for the preservation of the one thing a manipulator must always destroy: our own sovereign mind. If this story made you reflect, subscribe to our channel for more explorations into the shadows of history. Your support allows us to continue telling these vital stories.